It's 5 o'clock. We can roll. So welcome to this afternoon's session. It is the last session before we have our welcome party later on. And I know it's going to be a really great one. So welcome. I'm Nazma Rosado. I'll be your host. I know a couple of you have heard me say this like 3 times already today, but it really is great to have you all here with us. First of all, a little bit about Suffolk. We want to start off by thanking Suffolk University for hosting us. We're at Suffolk University Sawyer Business School, and Suffolk has hosted us last year as well as this year. And this is Startup Boston's this is the 8th annual Startup Boston Week, which is really pretty incredible. So thank you all for joining us. Suffolk, as you may notice, is really centrally located. It's in a fantastic location, and it's a really great place to bring together our entire ecosystem, working around innovation and bringing together all of the elements, right, that we really need in order to innovate and partner. So I'm really glad you're here, and I'm really grateful for Suffolk for hosting us. The goal behind Boston Startup Week is to really bring the entire greater Boston and New England startup community together, right? So we're looking at all industries. We're looking at ensuring that we have all startups, all bootstrappers, funds, no matter what fundraising stage you may be in, just really kind of bringing the whole community together so we can learn from each other and we can really partner and grow together. One thing I want to say about Startup Boston Week is it is mainly volunteer-led. The majority of the manpower behind it, really all the folks you see walking around in these beautiful green T-shirts are all volunteers. And it is an act of love. It takes the entire year to really pull this together, and I think we have some very impressive and important and wonderful leaders who help guide us through it. But we are really super pleased. It's kind of like, you're preparing for vacation, and this is that week of vacation, except it's really just like your mind's firing constantly because there's so many great ideas being exchanged. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to our moderator, Anne. Anne will introduce herself and introduce her panelists, and I'm actually going to stay up here and monitor the stream to see if we have any questions from the audience that I can share with you guys as we go. So Anne, over to you.
Thank you, Nazma. It's great to be here with all of you. My name is Anne Resch, and I'm the CEO of Elasta Consulting, which is an HR consultancy. To Nazma's point, I'm also a Startup Boston volunteer. This is my 3rd year. I'm very excited to be moderating the panel today with Amanda and Sean. I'm going to actually let them introduce themselves and share a little bit about their backgrounds and what brings them here with us today. So Amanda, if you want to go first.
Yeah, so hi everyone, my name's Amanda Hansen. I'm currently the Director of Operations for Pure Glow Airbrush Tanning. We're actually local, so come visit us after your party or throughout the week. But I've been in franchising on the franchisor side now for about 3 years, supporting multiple brands with Pure Glow right now, though we are very much in the startup phase, so this is kind of the perfect time to meet with you guys and feel very happy to be here.
Sean?
Name is Sean Bach. I've been in franchising 20 plus years. Started my career as an in-house attorney at Cold Stone Creamery. Being an attorney was too much fun, so I decided to navigate my way away from the legal department. But I'm currently with the concept of Minilux. Minilux is 23 locations in the Boston, Tampa, Dallas, LA area. They've just launched their franchise offering in March, and so I work with emerging franchise concepts like Minilux who are looking to grow outside their company-owned operations. So I'm really happy to be here.
Wonderful. Well, we're excited to have you. This is actually the first time we've had a panel on franchising, and so excited to learn more. And to the point of our title, Franchise Models Are Startups Too, my first question for both of you is, what are some of the similarities and differences between a franchise owner and an entrepreneur who starts a startup?
Go ahead.
Yeah, so obviously the thing that they have in common is you really want to own your own business, right? I think the first thing that comes to mind when I think about a franchise model versus a bootstrapping concept With franchising, you kind of know what you're getting in the sense of creative. You have all of these support systems in place where when you're a venture, you're doing a lot of the guesswork. But also to your question, you have to ask yourself, do you want to be the person making all the decisions? Do you want 100% autonomy? Do you want the one to be setting all of the prices? Do you want to be dictating what you're selling? If the answer is yes to all those questions, franchising might not be for you. So I think that's the first question you have to ask yourself when you want to be a business owner is, do I want to be a bigger part of a franchise community where I'm being led and guided throughout your entire journey from day one? Or do I want the latter where I'm going to be making all of those really big decisions?
Great point. What are your thoughts, Sean?
Yeah, I think it's somebody who loves to execute but is willing to take feedback and have a partnership in place usually makes excellent franchisees. In my career, I've always found that former college athletes, former military tend to do extremely well because the playbook is already written out for you. You're just executing. From an entrepreneurial standpoint, franchisees are as entrepreneurial as startup entrepreneurs, but they just have a different personality. And so a lot of joy that happens from a startup perspective because you're in control of everything. That doesn't happen in franchising, so there is a give and take. And the other thing I'd say, and we're both experiencing this with emerging franchisors, there are different personalities in the franchise space. So with a concept like Chick-fil-A or Burger King or McDonald's, you are taking orders, you're executing. With more emerging franchise concepts like Midi-Lux or Pure Glow, you may have a seat at the table and be able to give feedback to the franchisor and the organization as to how to better improve the operations or the model.
Just a quick follow-up to that. That's really interesting. What size, and I'm sure there's not just a single answer, but what size do you sort of see that ability to have a seat at the table versus it's gotten so large at this point that you're probably not going to have that seat at the table?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and it's kind of layered in a sense. So when you're in the startup phase, usually we call them at Pure Glow our pioneer franchisees. And they come to the table with feedback and ideas. As you grow larger with the franchisor, typically you'll have a franchise advisory council, and so it's people of the brand that really speak for the brand as a whole. With that said, though, I am a huge proponent of franchisees should always have a voice, even if you're the last one signed. As a franchisor, you put pen to paper and something can sound really good, and it sounds like it's really going to work. But who knows better than the franchisees who are in their business or in their locations on a weekly basis or on a daily basis. So while there is a table, yes, but we also really encourage our franchisees to speak up. We don't want it to feel one-sided. We want it always to be a partnership, to Sean's point, and always a conversation.
I think a pretty bright line demarcation is typically when the founder is no longer the CEO. There is a natural evolution that always happens, and that typically can be when private equity comes into play. Okay. And then there's professional management that comes in. Usually that's when I have typically observed the relationships with the franchisee and the founder and the franchisor become more formalized, and you can't make that phone call to the founder anymore.
That makes sense. Okay. How about, do you feel that being a franchisee is maybe more cost-effective, less risk than bootstrapping, or is it maybe just a different type of risk? What are your thoughts there?
You're so kind always letting me go first, thank goodness. I do, listen, there is risk with any business that you're starting up, of course. I will say, though, I feel that there is less risk with franchising because typically the franchisor has made a lot of the mistakes for you during the startup phase. They give you guidelines from A to Z from day one. You'll typically have a franchise development team who does market research with you. Where is the best location? A lot of people who start a business select the wrong location, and then you're tied to a lease for 10 years at, let's say, $30,000, and you're wondering why, how am I ever gonna break even, right? So with the franchisor, you're able to kind of bridge the gap in some of those really big areas. And then it's also nice to, when you're bootstrapping, you're kind of, again, guessing on a lot of things. But with a franchisor, you go through, you do your research, of course, you go through an FDD, which is a franchise disclosure document, and it tells you the costs pretty much up front. You know, your build out costs, here's your range. This is what we expect you to pay for a market fund. So you have a lot of these numbers in front of you to make an educated decision. On top of that, your franchisor typically has built out a lot of vendor relationships. So that helps you as well. Something that we do with PureGlow too is, you know, you get all of your bids in from a construction standpoint. Well, we can't tell you what to do. We will guide you absolutely and say, you know what, I think you could probably get a better deal here. Where when you are bootstrapping, you may not necessarily have that support or that guidance.
Got it. Okay.
Yeah, I think it's a mitigation of risk across the board.
Okay.
That's probably the biggest piece, and then the other piece is the ability to scale more quickly. Because as an entrepreneur, you're creating your own playbook. That takes a lot of time to do that, to go from 1 unit to 2 units to 3 units to 4, where the playbook is already written for you. And a great example is with every sector of when you open your business, whether it's brick and mortar, bless you, or you're doing a service-based business that's not real estate-based. You have these vendors that Amanda talked about, and something as simple as like an insurance broker that is tied into the franchisor relationship makes a huge difference. Just had an example of a franchisee was a victim of a fishing expedition, wired $22,000 to somebody outside the country. And because we had a broker relationship set up, we mandated cybersecurity as protections, and lo and behold, her insurance was covering it. So when you think of, that's the difference between a startup and franchising, where maybe a startup doesn't think about getting cybersecurity, all those things start to add up and make a big difference.
Interesting. Sean, I'm going to ask you this one first. Pull on your attorney background as well as your expertise in the franchise space. Are franchise owners employees, and are they also of the franchisee? And then are they also considered employees of the overall organization and parent company?
Yeah, that's a great question. No, it's you are an individually separate operating company operating under a license for a business model and trademarks. So that is your relationship and is not an employer-employee relationship.
Okay.
To the point where, from a franchisor's perspective, we cannot dictate to the franchisees who they hire, who they can fire, how they compensate their employees. So there's a rule called the joint employer relationship, where if a franchisor gets too involved in the relationship of the franchisee and their employees, they can be held jointly liable for any actions that an employee takes against the franchisee. So franchising, while it provides a heck of a lot of oversight and guidance, the employee relationship is someplace where franchisors do not step into.
Okay. And a little bit more around that joint employer liability. Is that the franchisee's responsibility to, I guess, pay attention and safeguard that? I'm sure the franchisor is also very involved, but what does that look like?
Yeah, I mean, a franchisor can advise on how to properly train their employees. They can advise, here's the uniform they must be wearing.
Got it.
But there's other issues in regards to how you compensate, how you fire, who you hire, that you cannot cross that line. And so where a franchisee gets that assistance is typically just about every payroll company, from ADP to Paychex to, there are bigger consulting suites of HR consulting groups who will advise the franchisees on state laws. There are very simple things in terms of paid break. If somebody's working 8 hours, what's the mandatory amount of break time, right? And so a franchisor cannot dictate or mandate that. It's state-led.
Okay. Amanda, anything from your perspective?
Yeah, I think, you know, great points, of course, and nothing you can really negotiate on that end, right?
Right.
But what a franchisor can offer in the area of employees is they can guide you on how to recruit, telling you what best practices are in place as far as what platforms they've seen the best results from. They can give you guidance on what type of candidates to look for. They can even give you job description examples. So it's not like you're starting 100% from scratch as you would bootstrapping. So there is guidance around that. But yes, to Sean's point, the franchisor doesn't have a whole lot to do with that.
Got it. Okay. How about marketing? And obviously that's very broad, but what does that look like for the franchise owner? How involved and how independent can they be with their marketing efforts? And what support do they receive from the franchisor?
You love marketing.
Okay.
Do you want to take? I mean, I'm happy to piggyback.
Secretly, I've always wanted to be in the marketing
Yes.
department. None of the CMOs ever wanted to bring me on board, but here's what's interesting is that the reason that franchising succeeded so early in the life cycle, and let's talk like McDonald's in the 50s and 60s, is because marketing was very decentralized. So what happened is that these franchisees had the name McDonald's behind them, and they were the ones doing the grassroots and doing 100% of the marketing. That started to evolve when TV came into play and commercials started to kick in. And now it's even become more centralized. So it's swung from decentralized, where the franchisee's doing all the marketing, to now it's actually becoming more centralized in the franchisors section. And the reason being is that algorithms change every day. So Instagram, Facebook, those are where the areas where a lot of franchisors are playing. So it's very difficult for a franchisee to keep up on a day-to-day basis. And so that's where the power and responsibility has shifted more towards the franchisor. I will say that there's nothing more powerful than building relationships and being eyeball to eyeball with people. We both worked at a concept called Dry Bar, and there's nothing better than having a local owner and operator, Mandy from Louisville, who you're seeing every day. She's a franchisee, but she's going to the other businesses. She's creating partnerships and relationships. There's nothing more valuable than that, especially when somebody comes in and says, "Can you donate to my silent auction?" Right? That doesn't happen in corporate-run structures. I can't imagine going to Starbucks and asking the manager for, a donation for a silent auction.
Yeah, great answer. And I think to piggyback on that a little bit too, so franchisors typically have guardrails on certain things too. So to Sean's point, they will typically market nationally, and then the franchisees typically have things that they can and cannot do. I think what's most important, right, is keeping the brand integrity. So with local studio marketing, grassroots marketing efforts, they will still typically run their ideas by the franchisor. Hey, I want to get this creative looked at. I want to be using this. Okay, so then the franchisor is going to look at that. They're going to approve it. Maybe they want to offer a specific discount in their community, which is so very important to Sean's point. They'll also run that by the franchisor, and they'll kind of brainstorm and be like, you know what, I think that's a really good idea. Or, wow, that discount sounds really steep. Let's talk about that. So even though you're doing grassroots marketing, if you're offering something to the community, you're typically going through the franchisor to talk through that as well. But I will say your ROI is always grassroots marketing. To Sean's point, going out in the community, get your face out there. I myself have been doing this for our Seaport location that's opening up on the 13th. And
That was a great plug, Amanda.
wasn't intentional. We were talking about
What date
grassroots
was
marketing.
that?
Yeah, right. That would be on the 13th.
What is the address, Amanda?
September, yeah, 100 Northern Avenue. But I had a lot of fun though, which is kind of selfish, but I had a lot of fun meeting other managers in the area, and I'm asking questions because we are new to the Seaport community. I'm asking questions. When are you guys really busy? What are your busy days? What are your busy hours? What is your demographic? Where are these people coming from? So by me doing that, it's not just me trying to get the name of the brand out there. I'm also doing market research for the brand. So I think that's another part of marketing that kind of goes overlooked, and some people think, oh, I don't feel like walking around, or it's a lot of work. It is a lot of work, but there's a lot that you get out of it too, and you meet a lot of great people and a lot of good connections. To Sean's point, feels a little bad and a little silly when you go ask for a $500 donation. They're like, I don't even, who are you? Where are you from? But yeah, it's a lot to it.
Makes sense. And how do you think about geographically? So if there are several franchises within like the greater Boston area as an example, but it's a national brand, is there a sense of kind of a local group of franchise owners? What does that look like?
Yeah, that's a great idea. It kind of goes to what I said earlier. We very much believe in a sense of community and having a relationship. We call the franchisors, we call ourselves at Pure Glow the support center. But we very much not only believe in having a relationship between the support center and our franchisees, we 100% believe in peer-to-peer support. Whether it's in Boston, over to our new franchisee who's opening later this month in Arizona. We have what we call town halls on a quarterly basis, which will probably eventually move to monthly, which is very common. Because while, again, we are franchisors saying, do this, we're gonna guide you to this, here are your best practices. Who knows better than someone else who has already gone through the same experience or is going through the same thing? Even something as small as, hey, how do you really motivate your team? What are they incentivized? Because mine is not incentivized by money. Do you have another idea? And so if I'm sharing that as a franchisor, that's just based on my own experience, but I'm getting that information from my franchisees. So to answer your question, we very much value peer-to-peer support, and we highly encourage it.
I think the common misconception, or what is not appreciated by someone not coming in, who has not been in the franchise industry and is a new franchisee, is the power of the network effect that Amanda's talking about. Because communication has become so easy in terms of, digital wise, like franchisees can share information left and right like there's no tomorrow. And so you get the benefit of the franchisor saying, here are the best practices, but more importantly, you get franchisees sharing franchisee information. So what's worked from local store marketing? What's worked in operations? What's the best way to hire and recruit? So that it's really important if you're looking into a franchise, when you're going through the due diligence, talk to other franchisees in the system, because they're going to be a really great resource for you.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I'd also like to add to that, this is always my favorite, culture. It builds a sense of culture within the brand, and that will make or break a brand 1,000%. So when you have the relationships, not just from the support center to peers, but from peer to peer, it makes it more fun. And work should be fun. Owning a business should be fun. And when you have other people to go through that with you and be your support system, it makes a world of difference.
And you talked about franchisees being in the same market.
Yeah.
From a legal standpoint, because that's the fun part of this, right? Every franchisee should get a protected territory. So whether it's real estate based or whether you are owning a painting company, you should have a defined territory that will exclude other franchisees from poaching customers in that area. So that's not to say that the franchisor cannot advertise nationally and hit your clients in that market, but there should be afforded protections. And if there's not on the franchise side in that relationship, then that's a red flag.
Okay, that's helpful. What about maybe some of the downsides, or at least perceived downsides? The sort of sense of maybe a big brother or the franchisor directing, this is my business, I don't want the franchisor to be directing me. What have maybe you seen over time and like lessons learned for franchise owners?
There's plenty of downsides.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's so. I think where we see it in the emerging franchise space, and when I define emerging, it's usually less than 50 units open, is that there is now a sub-industry within franchising that's all about selling franchises. So you have these broker networks that get 40 to 50% of a franchise fee, and they don't care whether or not it opens or is successful because they can move on to the next brand. So there's this cottage industry that is about to support and prop these emerging franchise concepts. And so as someone who is investigating franchising as a possibility, you really want to, one, get to know who's the salesperson who's talking to me, what is their incentive, are they employed by the franchisor? California has it's on Governor Newsom's desk to sign an additional disclosure rule that is now mandating that brokers are disclosing how much money they're making off of these franchise sales. Because I do think, like, if we're not taking care of it from a franchise industry perspective, that could ruin it for everyone. And so you see a lot of franchise concepts saying, we've sold 300, we've sold 200 locations, but the question is really, how many have you opened and how many of them are profitable?
And how many have closed?
And how many have closed? So I think from a downside perspective, there's that. I think the other downside is that private equity has now really come into this space. And so one, private equity has incentivized these emerging franchise concepts to sell a lot of franchises. They've rewarded those companies in the past. They're no longer doing that now. But time and time again, what you find is that when private equity comes in, the culture changes, the directives change. And so as a franchisee, you don't have any control on who the actual owner is or when the sale happens. And you're at the whim of a potential private equity that's looking to squeeze every penny out of you. So those are things you really need to consider and ask if you're talking to a founder or if you're talking to a franchisor that's private equity owned. Like, ask them how long they plan on owning it. So those are definitely the downsides.
Okay, that's great advice. Amanda?
Yeah, I mean, I think that covers a big, broad spectrum of it. I think also, to our point earlier, depends on your personality and what you're really looking for. Because there are some guardrails, being a part of a franchise. I find that whenever I'm speaking to a franchisee and we're talking about changes or we're talking about something we're implementing that might not always be super fun, I explain the why behind it. I feel that when you give people a why behind, they are more inclined to understand and to be on board. I think another key to, stepping away from the big brother effect is always being transparent. Again, when you're not hiding things, when you're being upfront, when they see that you care and that you really have them in your interest and top of mind, they're more inclined to, do the changes or suggestions or recommendations, and sometimes some mandatory things as well. So I think it's the why, transparency, and again, building relationships. I'm very much, we all are so used to Zoom, right, and being virtual, but there is a lot to be said about being in person. And so I think it's really important throughout any journey in the franchisor's state to spend time with your franchisees. If franchisees have a relationship with you, again, they're more inclined to listen to you and what you have to say and why you're recommending or saying this needs to be executed.
Makes sense. If someone is new to this world and looking to open a franchise, how do they sort of suss out whether the franchisor is going to value those types of relationships that you're speaking to? Do you have tips for kind of figuring out what the culture is?
Yeah, so most franchisors do something what's called confirmation day.
Okay.
But prior to that, do your research, do some digging, go on LinkedIn, see if they have contacts to the brand that you can connect with. It actually is, I know franchising seems like this really big world, but it's actually quite small. And so you might actually stumble upon someone who knows someone in the space that you're looking. But once you get to that point and you're really starting to commit to it, franchisors typically host something called Confirmation Day. We coined it something really cute, Glow Day. And so you spend roughly 48 hours, a couple days, getting to know the internal team. It's very organic. You can ask any question that you like. You come into this space, you see what it looks like. You speak to the team members that are working there because you can't fake that. Right? And so, again, it goes to building the relationships in person.
Yeah, I grew up in the franchise development world, so I'm going to give you some secrets that if you promise not to tell anybody else. But when you go through a franchise sales process, it's important to be introduced to franchisees so that you speak to them before you sign on. Typically, what I try to do is I try to introduce a franchise candidate to what I call like-kind people. Those are people who have similar backgrounds and similar personalities who they feel like, okay, if this person can do it, then I can do it. But my tip to any friend, or if I'm going to invest in a franchise, is I get the names from the salesperson, but then there is a section in the FDD that lists every franchisee. So then what I say is, okay, Mr. Salesperson, I want to contact these 10 people. Will you put me in touch with them? And then I have a set of questions, standardized questions, 5 to 6. The last question is always, if you had to do it all over again, would you invest in this business? Yes or no, and why? And that, if you have your standardized questions, you're able to talk to at least 5 or 6 of them. You're going to get a true understanding on the franchisor and what they do and how they stand by their word.
Great advice. I should have told you it's being live streamed.
If you're a good franchisor, you do have validators.
I would assume
yes.
that.
Otherwise,
that.
red flag, you're hiding something.
Right.
Yep.
Yes.
Right. Makes sense. How about funding? What have you seen maybe as successful or things to be thinking about if you're considering funding?
You want to take that?
Yeah, that's you. I'm more operations and all the fun
Okay, so
stuff.
this is where the benefit of joining a franchise comes into play. Typically, SBA is the best route for somebody who is new into business ownership. And SBA has a really great longstanding, so the SBA program is a support system for lenders. So a lender is not a part of the SBA. They just get a guarantee from the SBA itself, right? So your lender is not associated with the SBA. They're just going through the SBA program. Now, lenders like to make money and they like to reduce their risk. And so the best way to make money is to make loans that are risk-free or somewhat risk-free. So SBA does that. And the fact that they are loaning into a system that has a history of closures or profitability, SBA lenders love franchising. And so when you have a track record, as a franchisor does, you get to be pre-approved. So your ability to get a loan in a franchise concept is much, much easier than if you're going to do a startup. From an SBA loan perspective, let's just assume your total investment is $500,000. What an SBA lender is going to be asking for is 20 to 30% down. So that's $100,000 to $150,000. They're also going to want another 10% of capital in reserve. And then on top of that, they're going to want to see how are your living expenses covered for the next 18 months. Typically, if you're married or in a relationship, your partner or spouse can present that income while the business is getting up and running. But to open a business that costs $500,000 to open and only have $150,000 to $200,000 is a really, really great program to have in place. And the great news from an SBA perspective is they look at your credit score. Do you have enough to make that down payment? And they don't look for any other collateral. Because lenders are getting guaranteed from the SBA government that if the loan goes south, they're virtually not losing any money.
Great, that's helpful. All right, well, I know we have an audience here and then online, and I'm sure there are a lot of questions. Maybe we'll start online first, if there are any.
Sure, there is one online question. The question is, what is your favorite book or course on how to create a franchise company, not be a franchisee?
That's a great question. I don't even know if I have an answer to that one.
Yeah, I do have an answer to that. So the first one is there's 2 books. Shelley Sun, she's the founder of Brightside. She wrote a book back in 2009, 2010. Really, really valuable in terms of how to start a franchise organization. And then the most recent one is Alicia Miller. She's focused on private equity and venture capital in franchising. But if you are going to start up as a franchisor, it's a book that's necessary for you to read because it goes through the life cycle of an emerging franchisor to more of a mature and beyond. I can tell you, like, I'm an investor in emerging franchise concepts, and had I read Alicia's book beforehand, I never would have been in this emerging space because of the failure rate. But I think my 20 years of history hopefully is going to help me from that perspective. But those two books are really great. So I don't know the name, Shelley's book, but that's a handy one. And then Alicia Miller. Alicia is Alicia. Yeah.
Great. Are there questions?
I have a couple of questions, but they all have short answers.
love that.
So I don't have any franchise experience, so everything is kind of coming out of hearsay and that kind of stuff. So in my mind, there's two types of franchises, like physical space franchises, like Mini Lux or Pure Glow or like Subway, and then things like Sean, you mentioned, like a merit prize or like an insurance. Are there other flavors of franchise, or is that basically it? That's part one. And then part two is, my understanding, again, based on hearsay, is that for the physical franchises, one location is not enough as a franchisee. Like, does that depend on the type? Like, for example, if I get one Mini Lux, is that enough? Or do I really need 3 to become profitable, or that kind of stuff? And then, well, let's start there.
I love.
Which question do you want to tackle?
I'll tackle the second one, but to your answer of one location. I really think it depends on what you want as a business owner. How profitable do you want to be? You could be very successful and, succeed your break-even number in your first year with one unit. So it really depends on your appetite for how big you want your business to be.
Yeah, to answer your question on the flavors of franchising, well, one, I think, is most people would be shocked at what is a franchise or what is offered as a franchise. Howard Schultz famously always said they'll never franchise, but a third of their locations in the United States are technically licensed or franchised, right? Most franchises are business B to consumer, so B to C. You do have some B2B. Express Employment is a great example. They are a recruiting company and staffing, but they're in the franchise space. So while restaurants typically are the big, 900-pound gorilla, what you're seeing is a lot of brick and mortar transitioning to franchising. The biggest growth that's happening now is in home services. So everything from painting to fencing to gutters to literally there was a gutter franchisor that was sold for $65 million.
That's so crazy.
I mean, think about that, right? So there's all sorts of business that you wouldn't think are franchise, and then there's others that don't franchise. So retail is not a good franchise business model because the margins are so thin. So you'd be surprised. And to research, entrepreneurial.com is a great resource for a franchise repository of all franchise offerings. Every January, they release their top 500 rankings. I wouldn't put any trust or faith in the rankings, but they do it. And you have a third question?
Yeah. So my other 2 mini questions are like kind of legalish. So you mentioned the use case where as a franchisee, you don't have any stake in like what the franchisor does, so they could sell to a PE company. But you have a contract with a franchisor. A PE can't come in mid-contract and change the terms of it, right? So what do you mean by like a PE squeezing? Yeah. And then the second part of that is you mentioned calling other franchisees to get like their kind of take on it. I would assume that the contract I have with a franchisor has some sort of an anti-disparaging statement. So how do you know that you're getting a real answer?
I wish that was a real thing. I wish that was a real thing.
So I don't mean to laugh, but like when you call a franchisee and you ask how it's going, they'll just tell you what's wrong. So when the disparagement stuff, like, they're going to be honest, and as long as they're being honest, there's no disparagement going on, right? Now, if you say like, well, the CEO is a criminal and stealing money, and that's not proven out, then you've got issues, right? So what was your other question?
Like the
on-
PE coming in and
Yeah,
squeezing, how would
yes.
that happen?
Yes, they can't change the terms of the contract. They can't increase your royalty rate, but they can, most of the time, there's a provision called the brand fund, and they can typically raise those fees. They can insert other fees. The other thing that typically happens, though, is it's the support level that tends to wane. So what they see is the SG&A and the franchisor level, and they say, well, do we really need these many consultants to help support the business? Do we need these many people in the marketing department? So they'll start cutting costs, and then the support starts to diminish. Yeah, that's where you see the goodwill diminishing. Good questions.
Yeah.
Thank you. Hi, I'm similar to the first caller that's online about trying to be a franchisor. What advice would you give as far as a startup like mine, just starting up, have a patent, and I'm trying to see if that's be a better way to initially just start off trying to be a franchisor?
What would you say, Amanda?
I would say it probably depends on what you're trying to patent as well. That's a big part of it. Did you want to share?
I not trying to patent. I do have a regular
do have
patent on a smart, healthy toilet seat. That
Okay.
it's basically what we do is we turn your bathroom into your doctor's virtual office with our telehealth AI, the smart toilet that takes your vital signs,
Yeah.
temperature, weight, BMI, blood pressure, and the smart mirror to a patient portal, and there's other fixtures. So we basically turn your bathroom into your doctor's virtual office. And I want to try to take advantage of the patent and try to see if, developing on the idea of being a franchisor would be, is there something like a accelerator or incubator or a Sean Bach that can,
Sean, everyone needs a Sean Bach in their life, let me tell you. That's, do you want to take it?
Yeah. It's so franchising is interesting because there's many different channels. So where I think you may be able to play well is really a distributorship agreement. So this is where car dealers. So a car dealer will buy a territory, let's just say Ford, right? And Ford will supply all of the equipment. So you're acting as Ford, you're selling different territories, and you're giving them those territory rights, and it's their job to sell your equipment, right? And so there's a win-win relationship there. So it doesn't necessarily need to be in the franchise space per se, and I think that a product like that is better suited for more of a distributor type of program rather than a franchising program.
I would agree. Great concept, though.
Yeah.
I would just like to know if you have any comments about evaluating franchises for their potential of being a fad. I see a cool store, I'm like, oh my gosh, it would be great in Garden City in Rhode Island, and I think it could really go, but it might not be popular in 3 years, 5 years. I might want to sell. How do you kind of evaluate that? And as an entrepreneur, can that be a model just to get in early and then sell, before it dies, the fad dies?
Right.
Yeah, you technically could. I mean, there is nothing wrong with, becoming a franchisee and saying, I'm signing on, I want to exit the business in 5 years. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. I think there's a lot of value in having an exit strategy. Are there franchises that are just trendy? Yes. Not something I necessarily recommend. So you just really want to do your research and see how long the franchise has been around. What are their core values? What are they selling? What is their ROI? So you really just have to do a lot of research and see what they're offering as well. Another thing too that I think is important is just looking at the menu, meaning like the services that they offer. What are their price points? How often do they increase their prices? Like, take a deep dive into every little thing and see if it aligns with your values and what you're looking for. And you want to choose something broad, but that also has a niche. I'll use Pure Glow again as an example. The tanning industry is actually quite large, but we're the first to hit the space that is airbrush tanning. However, I do really see longevity in this brand because right now, after COVID, and what really should be forever in my opinion, but health and wellness is so important. And so there are things that are tried and true industries that will stick around forever. It's the boutique ones that usually are a little bit more on the trendy side.
And part of joining a franchise is a history of performance, right? So you want to mitigate your risk, and what that tends to happen is those fads tend to just spike and then just crash. So you've seen some life cycles, like you see that in desserts. You see the yogurt, right? Cold Stone.
This one is nothing but cakes.
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Check
Okay,
their
sorry.
year-over-year numbers.
It's not a fad. I
a
did
real
a
thing.
deep dive on Nothing But Cake. They had a compound annual growth rate of 15% year over year for 7 straight years. They were just sold to Rourke for $1 billion. And what's interesting is go on TikTok, and there are a couple of influencers who were amazed that Nothing But Cake is a national brand because they thought it was their little home bakery. But that's a really great point, because there are some concepts you think are fads aren't really, and they're just like they just grow 15% year over year, and that's the type of business you want. So
Yeah. Yeah. And there's
look, Nothing But Cake is a really solid business. Yeah.
We actually had a franchisee who owned one in a prior life of mine. So if you're really looking into that, well, I've heard nothing but great things. But nothing but great things. I love that pun. But also we talked about the FDD a little bit earlier, but there is nothing wrong of like having the conversation with the franchisor and asking for the FDD, because they do disclose some things along the way, as there's some things that a franchisor cannot disclose until you sign the agreement. But there are some good little sprinkles along the way that will guide you to whether or not this is a profitable business year over year.
And I will say, Amanda's right, the health and wellness is a growing trend. I also think that is an opportunity for regulators to step in. So there's men's testosterone franchises, there's the IV drip, and so those are health related, and you could very easily see state regulators coming in to kind of do more oversight and more regulations that aren't a part of the current P&L thought process.
I have a quick follow-up to that. Does the franchisee need to feel passionately about the brand or believe in it, have some level of knowledge of the industry, or is that not a prerequisite? Excuse me.
Depends on who you're asking. But there are both sides. I will say I mean, you can say differently, but I think 99% of the time, franchisees who are passionate about it succeed much further than someone who treat it like a 9 to 5, I clock in, I clock out, or they're not hands-on at all, which you'll have that with franchisees who grow, from 1 unit to 3 to 5, and that's completely organic and natural. So no, it's not a prerequisite, but you have better chances of succeeding if you are passionate about it. With any other industry, with any other job, right, of course. You want to
Yeah, I mean,
piggyback onto
I
that?
always live by the Simon Sinek rule of you got to have purpose, so profits are a byproduct of your purpose or passion. Even something like 1-800-GOT-JUNK, like some franchise owner may love the fact of that they're clearing out space for somebody's new home, or they're in transition, or maybe they find that they want to employ people who, maybe have been down on their luck, right? So there's a lot more passion beyond just the brand itself, and there may be something inherent in the business where they have an emotional attachment. But I do think that profit is a byproduct of the passion and not the other way around.
100%, because I think it's a trickle-down effect as well. Your team members feel it, and when they feel your excitement and your passion, they believe more in you, they believe more in the business, and then so when you're asking them, hey, we need to increase our membership sales, we need to increase our packages sales, you explain the why behind it, and they're like, oh yeah, this is not just benefiting us as a team, but also the business. And so when you have that passion trickle from a leader, it speaks volumes.
Makes sense.
My name is Farshid. Thank you for being here and sharing your insights. One follow-up question and two additional questions that are somewhat related. One is not fads, but what if the franchise has only been around for a year? I'm looking at one franchise company has been only been around for a year and a half. They've been in business for about 10 years, but they just started becoming a franchise. That's one.
Yeah.
The other two is there's something called a 401k rollover for a startup.
Yep.
401k ROBs. Is that worth it? And related to that, why would anyone take that chunk of money, pay franchise fees, etc., and not put it into real estate as a flip opportunity or something like that?
Sure. I'll let you take
What was the
question.
first
I'll
one?
do the-
So the first question was,
Only been around the franchise has only been existing
Oh,
1
for a
year.
year?
But operationally,
Oh,
it's
yeah.
for 10 years. That sounds like
that
you.
sounds like me. So that's exactly where I am right now with Pure Glow. There's nothing wrong with that. I think it just depends on where you want to be as a business owner. With a startup, of course, there are going to be hiccups along the way, and you as a pioneer franchisee have to understand that, and you have to be willing to go through some of those hiccups and us making mistakes as a franchisor to learn best practices. So I think if you're willing to be in a startup, you have to be a little bit more patient, a little bit more understanding. But with that also, you have a big voice and a seat at the table like we talked about earlier. When you do come in very early on, you get to bring a lot of feedback and be very candid and open about it. So I'd say that's a plus side of being at the early stages.
And I'll just add, I'll give kudos to Pure Glow. The executive. So if you are looking at an emerging franchise concept, look at the executives. What's the experience level that they have in regards to have they done this before, right? If they're new to franchising, it's a completely new business. So I'd be cautious on that. And then your question on rollover and 401k. I think it's personal. And personally, for me, I would never touch my 401k to roll into a risky business, whether it's franchise or not. Now, you may have a different risk profile, but you talked about real estate. Real estate is not as risky, right? So it would make more sense to roll it into that. What I've seen in terms of the cost of the upfront setup and the annual maintenance and administrative fees, it's just overly burdensome, and I'd rather get outside investors rather than touch a 401k. Yeah.
Hi there.
Hi.
I have a few questions that are rolled in
Sure.
many parts, and some of which touch upon
Some part
previously
A,
asked
some
questions.
part B, little I, two little I.
Speak my operational
So-
language.
I guess in a generalized way, because obviously there's a lot of variation, what are some ranges of expected returns? Because if you're licensing, I'm imagining X percent's going to the top. And related to that, what are the expectations of a franchisee as it relates to being a operator that's really like running it versus an owner? Like sometimes you hear about athletes, for example, that have like tens or hundreds of XYZ thing, and just wondering how is that, all things are possible, but as not the franchisor, but the franchisee, like how is it designed for that kind of expansion in general, or like what's the idealized path of the franchisee?
Yeah, I'll answer that one. So I think when I think of a perfect franchisee, of course, I would love for them to be in studio on a weekly basis. What I expect is for a franchisee to be in the studio at least 6 months to understand the business. Because if you were to hire a team member or a manager, right, and then they're calling you saying, hey, I have an issue here, I need to do X, Y, Z, and you can't even tell them what to do, that's not great for your business, right? So I would say minimum 6 months. It's very common for franchisees to be in the business for 6 months to a year. And then you have the franchisees who want to grow quickly, which is also great. There's nothing wrong with either, by the way. You have a franchisee who wants to grow quickly. Let's say they open 3 units in a year and a half. That's a lot. You have to have an infrastructure for that. And so they might be a bit removed, and so they have a manager in each, but they're still showing face to their team once a week. That's great as well. I also, as Sean has too, we've experienced franchisees who at one point just fully step away and they fully have their team in place. But that takes a lot of time, and that is choosing the right team members to run your business, and you really have to trust them to run your business, and it takes a lot of training. So there's nothing wrong with any of them, just the more passion and the more guidance you put into it is what you're gonna get out of it. Great question.
Yeah, and then your question on the margins and expected rate of returns, it's really industry specific. So restaurant wise, you're probably looking at 8 to 12% EBITDA. And the one thing to keep in mind, this is across any franchise concept. Whatever royalties you're paying, usually you find you get efficiencies by being a part of a network. So if you were to start your own business and you ran, a hamburger concept, right? You may make the same or less money than if you joined a McDonald's, because there's efficiencies in being a part of a network. So while the royalties are an expense line item, I consider it more of an investment. But it's really industry specific, so you really have to choose the industry first, then do the deep dive. So concepts from a Mini Lux, Dry Bar, Pure Glow, the beauty space is more, you should expect 12 to 20%. There are businesses like Express Employment, some home services-based businesses where you can see margins of 30, 40%. But those take much longer to ramp. So it takes 4, 5, 6, 7 years to get to where you need to be.
All right, we have a question from online, and then I think we can wrap it up. Any additional questions you guys have, you can catch the panelists following the session. So the online question is, do you have any experience about school franchises like Kumon? What is the usual royalty rate, percentage of the profit?
Yeah, so I lump school-based franchises into 2 camps. One is Kumon, which is the Mathnasium Kumon. That's kind of like the after-school supplemental training. So it is bricks and mortar. The fees there, royalties, probably somewhere between 5 to 8%. Probably all-in investments around $500,000 because it's brick and mortar. So that's more of your question on how many you need to own more than one of those, right? There's the other that's more of a real estate play, which is the Primrose, the Goddards of the world. Those are, you build a campus. So you're really in business 2 ways. One, you own the real estate itself, and then you're also a school as well. Those are really lucrative. They take a lot of time, a lot of investment. But if you can get an SBA loan on real estate and franchising, suddenly your amortization goes from 10 years to 27 years. So it's a pretty good opportunity. Not that I'm selling Primrose or Goddard.
It's like, excuse me, did you switch sides for a second, or?
All right, well, thank you so much. That was a really fantastic panel, guys. Thank you tremendously.